It's Reformation time. Everyone, pick a side. Unfortunately, England has bipolar disorder. They can't decide whether breakfast should be pea mush on chips or a toast sandwich, and they also can't decide whether to be Protestant or Catholic. England will be Catholic. Bro, you can't divorce your wife. England shall be Protestant. Let's go! Just kidding, it's still theologically Catholic, but I can do whatever I want. Just kidding, I'm king now and it'll be fully Protestant. Actually, I'm queen now and England will be Catholic and you're burned at the stake. Actually, I'm queen now and I'll allow some Protestant reforms in England. England had a problem, other than dentistry. You see, when the Reformation happened, Scotland accepted it wholesale, but England kept bouncing back and forth between Reformed and Catholic. So by the time Elizabeth became queen, there were a lot of people who were Reformed and Catholic in England, and they didn't like each other. She just wanted her country to be united, so she tried to make the Church of England a via media, or middle way between the two, so she would satisfy the majority of the people. She thought this would solve the religious conflict in England, but it actually made it much worse, and we're about to see why. But first, only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed, so if you want to see more, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind. If you liked the video, make sure to click the like button, and if you didn't, make sure to click the dislike button twice. You see, by making a compromise, Elizabeth satisfied the moderate majority, but she alienated the extremists on the fringes, and she persecuted both of them, which radicalized them. The Church of England, started by Elizabeth, was a moderate Calvinist church. It allowed soft versions of predestination and justification by faith alone, and it let everyone read the Bible. But it also had lots of external Catholic elements, like altars, images, prayer books, liturgical vestments, and of course, bishops. In the Church of England, all priests were under the authority of a bishop, but the Church of Scotland didn't have bishops. They were run by councils of priests, or presbyters, which is why they were called Presbyterian. The Church of England structure was a compromise between that and the papacy, where all bishops are under the authority of the Pope in Rome. But the Reformed in England thought this compromise wasn't good enough and they got radicalized. They became Congregationalists, saying all pastors should have direct authority over their own local churches. Some people gave up trying to reform the Church of England and became independent or separatist, saying all local congregations should be free of any denomination or national church structure. And some independents got so radicalized they became Baptist, saying we shouldn't even baptize babies because the church needs to be pure and fully made of members who really believe it. By trying to turn two factions into one, Elizabeth accidentally turned two factions into six. It's kinda like how in particle physics, when you collide two particles, you end up with a whole host of new particles. So there's a lot of tension. Let's hope it doesn't get any worse. When Elizabeth died, she was replaced by King James, who was king of England and Scotland, and he tried to unify the two kingdoms religiously. He tried to Episcopalianize Scotland by imposing bishops on the Presbyterian church there. He introduced other high church elements like holidays, kneelers, and prayer books, and when he did this, the Scotsmen rioted. These may seem like minor disagreements to us, but to the Scotsmen they were symbols of Catholic tyranny that had oppressed them for centuries. No Scotsman supports bishops. Well, I'm a Scotsman and I support bishops. No true Scotsman supports bishops. Due to pressure from the people, James had to walk back some of these changes, but there were two big things the Presbyterians still didn't like. One is prelacy, where bishops have authority over local pastors, and two is Erastianism, where the king is the head of the church. Presbyterians saw both of these as closely associated with one another. They opposed prelacy because bishops and presbyters are the same in the New Testament, and they didn't see why one should be elevated over the other, and Jerome says prelacy evolved over time. They opposed Erastianism because Christ is the only monarch over the church, not the king and not the pope, and they saw bishops as mini-monarchs. Because of this, Presbyterians had a lot less respect for monarchs in general. In other words, "Hail King James, glorious sovereign over the realms of England and Scotland." Oh, hey dude, what's up? You're not gonna speak more reverently to your king? Nah, you're totally depraved like the rest of us. God just appoints kings and rulers for practical reasons. You're just a silly little vessel. So obviously, King James did not like Presbyterians. He was also gay at a time when that was pretty scandalous. He's also famous for producing the King James version of the Bible. James wanted to civilize and colonize Ireland, which was Catholic and didn't speak English. So he told the English Episcopalians to form colonies there, but he needed more people, so he told the Scottish Presbyterians they could have religious freedom if they also formed colonies there. So now there's a lot of Protestants in Ireland. The Presbyterians who stayed in Scotland got heavily persecuted, but despite this, they never split off and formed a parallel church, because that would be the sin of separatism. So now there's even more tension. The Irish Catholics hate the Protestants that are colonizing them, and the Presbyterians and Episcopalians don't like each other either. Let's hope it doesn't get any worse. When James's son Charles became king, it got worse. He appointed William Laud as Archbishop of the Church of England, who made it more high church and cracked down on Calvinism. If James had pissed off the Scottish Calvinists, Charles had just pissed off the English Calvinists, but the English Puritans were more extreme and willing to fight. Laud didn't just reject the Calvinist view of church structure, though. He was also something called an Arminian. What's that? Calvinism teaches predestination, where before you were even born, God decided whether or not you'd be saved. A Dutch Calvinist named Arminius tried to clarify this is just because God knows whether or not you will believe and predestines you based on that, but in response, the Dutch Calvinist Church held the Synod of Dort, an ecumenical council that rejected Arminianism and clarified that God unconditionally predestines people, and that determines whether or not they will believe. This made British Calvinists really jealous. They wanted the Church of England to accept the Synod of Dort, and they wanted their own council to condemn Arminianism. The Puritans suspected a plot to make England Catholic again, especially because the king's wife was Catholic, and we all know the power of simping. This fear made sense because the 30 Years' War was going on in the continent, which was meant to wipe out Protestantism in Europe. The Protestants survived, but it took a serious toll on their countries. Catholicism was a political threat. Since the king's buddies ran the church, generally the rich were Anglican and the poor were Puritan. The king put heavy taxes on the poor and took a lot of their land. But luckily the king did not have absolute power thanks to something called Magna Carta. He had to share power with Parliament, which is made up of representatives from the people. One member of Parliament was Oliver Cromwell, who spoke out on behalf of the poor. He was a devout Puritan Congregationalist, but was not a separatist. He believed in purifying the Church of England, not leaving it. And he also didn't believe in rebelling against the government. Yet. Cromwell was very religious, but very opinionated. What are you reading? The Jesus Storybook Bible. Depictions of God? Away with this popish idolatry! Speaking of popish things, King Charles just imposed a new prayer book on Scotland that sounded very Catholic. So when a Scottish priest tried to preach from it, a Presbyterian lady named Jenny threw a chair at him. The Scottish Presbyterians had had enough. It was time to take their country back. So they summoned the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland and abolished bishops, just like that. The Church of Scotland was now once again truly Presbyterian. Then the General Assembly, led by Alexander Henderson, wrote the National Covenant, which was a promise to God that Scotland would always be Presbyterian. Covenant theology is a major theme of Presbyterianism, so the Scottish Presbyterians got called the Covenanters. The king considered that treason and declared war. But he was no match for the Scottish Covenanters, so he quickly gave up. But then the Scottish Parliament signed the National Covenant, meaning the country of Scotland was now in covenant with God to always be Presbyterian. The king considered that treason and declared war. But he was no match for the Scottish, so he quickly gave up. We now have our first faction of the English Civil War. The Irish Catholics are sick of being colonized by the English and Scottish, so they massacre the Protestant settlers. And some Catholic bishops join in and say this is a just war. So we now have our second faction of the English Civil War. I want to raise taxes. You can't do that. Then I'm shutting down Parliament. We're not backing down. I'll use my army. So will we. Now Cromwell knew it was sinful to rebel against the government, but Parliament was his government, so submitting to Parliament meant fighting against the king. It'd be kind of like if Congress declared war on the president. You could choose who to side with without sinning. Parliament didn't want to overthrow the king yet, they just wanted to fight for the right to exist and share power with the king. So they rallied up the angry Puritan peasants and went to war. So they fought for a few years, but neither side was really winning. Yo, Alex, you guys are tough. Can you give us a little help? We'll help you if you sign our covenant to always be Presbyterian. And so Alexander Henderson wrote the Solemn League and Covenant. That was a promise that England, Ireland, and Scotland would always be Presbyterian. So the Covenanters joined the Parliamentarians, and together they won the war and captured the king. Since the Church of England was the state church, Parliament now had control over it. Alright guys, we gotta decide how to run the Church of England. So in Westminster Abbey, Parliament summoned the brightest Reformed scholastic theologians to decide how the church would be run. Now, the Westminster divines were all Puritan, meaning they wanted the Church of England to be purely Calvinist, so they were able to agree on most theological things. They wrote the Westminster Confession, which taught strict predestination and condemned Arminianism, just like the Synod of Dort. It taught covenant theology, where God's people have been the same group of people under the same covenant going back to the Garden of Eden. It taught the Reformed view of the sacraments, where baptism saves, and communion is the real body and blood of Christ, but only for those who have faith. They banned all images of Jesus and said Sunday was the Sabbath. But they couldn't agree on church government. Some of the Westminster divines were English Presbyterians, some were Congregationalists, and some were Independents. Alexander Henderson, who wrote the Solemn League and Covenant, was not happy. "Hey yo, you said it would always be Presbyterian!" So the Westminster Assembly invited delegates from the Church of Scotland, which they saw as the purest Reformed Church, to help solve the debate. The four of them had to convince the Westminster Assembly to adopt Presbyterianism. George Gillespie proved Presbyterianism from the Old Testament. Samuel Rutherford argued against the independence by saying every country should have one united church and everyone in that country is obliged to be a part of that church. But what if the church is liberal, though? Then I can split from it, right? No. Rutherford said the only exception to this rule is if the national church of your country requires you to believe something that is false, which for him was the case in Catholic countries. Rutherford says if your church embraces false teaching, you make a negative separation, where you separate from false doctrine in the church while still being part of the church. But Rutherford says it's only ever okay to make a positive separation where you split off and form a new church if you are wrongly excommunicated for believing the right things. That is what happened to the Reformers. Robert Bailey makes this same point even more strongly in his treatise against non-denominationals, where he says absolutely nothing justifies leaving the established church and starting a new denomination. Not even if they worship false gods in the church, because people did that in the Old Testament, but the prophets didn't leave. Not even if there's heretical church leadership, because that happened in the Galatian church, and Paul didn't tell people to leave. Not even if there's blasphemy of the Eucharist, because that happened in the Corinthian church, and Paul didn't leave. Based on this, Rutherford and Bailey would have condemned most modern conservative Presbyterian denominations as schismatic and told everyone to join the established mainline denominations regardless of how liberal they've become. The Westminster Assembly officially sides with the Scottish Presbyterians, making the Church of England Presbyterian. Except it's not. Even though the Assembly endorsed Presbyterianism, Parliament as well as Cromwell's army are still Congregationalist, so they're very slow at implementing the confession. But still, the Westminster Confession becomes the universal authority for Presbyterians everywhere, including Scotland and Ireland. But this does begin a breach between Parliament and the Covenanters. King Charles sees not everyone likes Parliament, so he tries to make as many alliances as possible. He figures if he can unite all the other three factions, he can defeat Parliament and take England back. So Charlie goes to the Covenanters. "Hey guys, Parliament didn't give you the Presbyterian utopia they promised? Join me, and I'll make England Presbyterian." Then Charlie goes to the Irish. "Hey guys, are these filthy Protestants bothering you?" Yeah. "Join me, and we'll ban Protestants from Ireland." But then Charlie takes it a step too far. Remember, he has a Catholic wife from France. So he goes, "Hey yo, France, these evil Puritans hate Catholicism. Want to come invade my own people and free me from Parliament?" Now, if there's anything you know about England, it's that they don't like France. So if you're an English ruler, the worst PR decision you could possibly make is telling France to invade your own country. Parliament found King Charles guilty of treason and cut off his head. What the heck, guys? Killing the king wasn't part of the deal. The split between the Covenanters and the Parliamentarians was obvious, and the king's son took notice. "Hey guys, if you help me retake the throne, I'll sign your covenant to be Presbyterian forever." That was all they needed. The Royalists, Covenanters, and Irish Catholics were all now united against Cromwell, but they were no match for him. Cromwell easily took over the Protestant lands in Ireland, and they had been massacred by the Irish for a long time, so Cromwell's conquest of Ireland included many massacres of Irish Catholics. This is one of the biggest stains on his legacy. Then Cromwell conquered Scotland, but he was a lot nicer to them and let them stay Presbyterian. With no allies left, Charles had to flee. "Hey Cromwell, Parliament kinda sucks. Can you just take over as king?" "Never. No king but Christ." "Okay, then we won't call you king. We'll call you Lord Protector of the Realm." Works for me. So Cromwell marched in with his goons, dissolved Parliament, and basically made himself dictator. Cromwell's reign was very authoritarian because he enforced all the rules of strict Puritanism. Christmas? That's papist. Banned. Dancing? That's degenerate. Banned. The theater? Have you met theater kids? Banned. But Cromwell was also very religiously tolerant for his time. The established church was Congregationalist, but you didn't strictly have to join it, so he gave religious freedom to Independents, Baptists, and Presbyterians. He also greatly improved the economy and invested a lot in science, education, and healthcare. But then he died. And at this point, England was sick of Cromwell's Puritanism, so they invited Charles back, made him king, and the Church of England became Episcopalian again. The Presbyterian and Congregationalist ministers were ejected from it. But it was even worse for Scotland. Charles II broke his promise and broke the Solemn League and Covenant. He imposed Episcopalianism on Scotland and said anyone who did not confess that he was head of the church would be excommunicated. And many Scottish Covenanters were martyred during what was called the Killing Times. 18-year-old Presbyterian women were drowned in the rising tide for refusing to acknowledge the king as head of the church, because they believed they had made a covenant with God to only acknowledge Christ as the head of the church, and to do otherwise would be sin. Presbyterians had a bit more freedom in Ireland, so many of them moved there and then moved to America, so they got called Scots-Irish by the time they arrived. But then something happened that got Presbyterians and Episcopalians to work together. Just like the Puritans warned, Charles converted to Catholicism, and his son James ruled over England as a Roman Catholic. This was unacceptable for the populations of England and Scotland. They overthrew James in the Glorious Revolution and replaced him with William of Orange and Mary. And then a compromise was reached, where the King and Queen of England would always have to swear to protect Presbyterianism in Scotland and Episcopalianism in England. This satisfied most of the Covenanters, so most of them rejoined the Church of Scotland, except for a few who thought it wasn't good enough because it still wasn't the Solemn League and Covenant. These people are now called the RPCNA. And this is basically how things are today. But a side effect of these wars of religion was secularism. Want to stop fighting over religion? Just make religion matter less in public life. The Enlightenment taught that religion is more of a private thing, that denominational differences don't matter, and that religion is just about being a good person, not following theological dogmas. But as the next few centuries were about to reveal, the problem wasn't religion, the problem was human nature, and if people wouldn't fight over religion, they would find other things to fight about. Now, the Puritans didn't win in the end, but they did show the world what a Puritan republic free of the king could look like, and many of them wanted to recreate Cromwell's Puritan republic elsewhere, and they did, in 1776.